All right, hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf, continuing the lectures on the proofs of God. We're on the 12th lecture, Critique of Absolute Necessity. This is continuing lectures on the cosmological proof. In the previous lecture, the concept of absolute necessity was explained of absolute necessity. Very often absolute means nothing more than abstract, and very frequently too it is thought that the word absolute everything is said and that no further definition can or ought to be given. In fact, it is just with this definition that we are concerned. Absolute necessity is abstract, the abstract pure and simple insofar as it depends on itself and does not subsist in or from or through an other. But we have seen not only that it is adequate to whatever its concept may be, such that we can compare the concept with its external existence, but also that it is this very adequacy itself. Thus, one may be taken as the external aspect is contained in itself in such a way that this very dependence on itself, the identity or reference to self, that constitutes the isolation of things in virtue of which they are contingent, is an independence that is really a lack of independence. Possibility is an abstraction of the same kind. A thing is possible if it does not contradict itself. That is, it is what is merely identical with itself, something in which there is no identity with an other, while at the same time it does not have its other within itself. Contingency and possibility are different only in that the contingent has, in addition, a determinate existence. The possible has only the possibility of an existence, but the contingent itself has only the sort of existence that is of absolutely no value beyond being a possibility. It is, but just as much it is not. In contingency, being there or existence is, as has been remarked, dissected to such an extent that it is at the same time determined to be something that is intrinsically a nullity, and consequently the transition to its other, to the necessity that is expressed within itself. It is the same as what is found in abstract identity, which is a simple reference to self. It is known as possibility, and as such, it is not yet anything. That something is possible does not yet indicate anything. Identity is characterized as what it truly is, as a need. Okay, so as seems to be pretty straightforward to me, but I don't know, this discussion of possibility and contingency in the relation and semi-identity may make sense to you guys. DM, Josh, Danny.
I mean, it felt pretty straightforward to me.
Yeah.
Okay. What is lacking in this definition finds its complement, as we have seen, in the definition that is opposed to it. Necessity is not abstract, but rather truly, absolutely, solely in virtue of the fact that it contains the connection with an other within itself. It is differentiation within itself, but as something that is sublated and ideal. Thus it contains what belongs to necessity as such, but is distinguished from the latter as being external and finite, as something connected to an other that remains and counts as a subsisting being, and so is merely dependence. It is also called necessity insofar as mediation in general is essential to necessity. The connection of its other with an other, which is what constitutes it, is however not supported from its end. Absolute necessity transforms any such relation to an other into a relation with it to itself, and thus produces what is really inner harmony with itself. Spirit elevates itself above the contingency and necessity, therefore, because these thoughts are in themselves insufficient and unsatisfying. It finds satisfaction in the thought of absolute necessity because the latter is at peace with itself. Its result, however, as result is, it is simply necessary. Thus all aspiration, all effort, all longing after an other are lost, for in it the other has disappeared. There is no finitude in it. It is totally complete within itself. It is infinite and present within itself. There is nothing outside it. It has within itself no limit, for its nature is to be with itself. It is not the elevation to this necessary on the part of spirit that as such produces satisfaction, but rather the goal, insofar as spirit attains to it. If we pause for a moment to consider this subjective satisfaction, we are reminded of what the Greeks found in subjection to necessity. To yield to inevitable fate was the counsel of the wise, especially the wisdom of the tragic chorus, and we admire the we admire the repose of their heroes, with which they, unbending spirits, freely accepted the lot assigned to them by destiny. This necessity and the aims of their wills that were annihilated by it, the compulsory force of such destiny and freedom, these appear to be the opposing elements which allow no reconciliation, not even any satisfaction. In fact, the sway of this ancient destiny is tinged with a sadness that is not driven away by defiance or bitterness, nor is it made odious, and all lamentation is suppressed by silence rather than stilled by the healing of the heart. The satisfaction found by spirit in the thought of necessity is to be sought only in this, that spirit abides by that abstract result of necessity, expressed in the words, "It is so," a result that spirit accomplishes within itself. In this pure is there no longer any content. All purposes, all interests, all wishes, even the concrete feeling of life have disappeared and vanished in it. Spirit produces this abstract result within itself because it has given up just this content of its will, the substance of its life, and has renounced everything. It thus transforms into freedom the force exercised upon it by fatality. For this force can lay hold of it only by seizing on those aspects that in its concrete existence have an inward and an outward determinacy of existence. In regard to external existence, human beings stands under an external force in the form of other human beings, circumstances, etc. But external existence has its roots in the internal, in human drives, interests, purposes. These are the bonds, whether justified and morally ordained or not, that subject humans to the force. But the roots belong to their inner life. The roots are theirs. They can tear them out of their hearts. Their will, their freedom are that strength of abstraction whereby the heart can make itself the grave of the heart. So when the heart inwardly renounces itself, it leaves to the force nothing on which it can lay hold. What is crushed by the force is an existence devoid of heart, an externality in which force can no longer affect a person who is outside the sphere in which it strikes. Deja vu. I'll show you after this, but before reading this, I actually wrote something in the morning that was exactly almost this. And it was precisely about this notion of freedom, and how even in surrender, even in what's the word? There's a word for it, when you give up to your circumstances, like you kind of submit. Resignation, yeah. Yeah, even in like resignation, whether the resignation of a slave, the resignation of anything, even that is a moment of freedom because you have to will to resign to it. If you don't will it, nothing can break into you. And even that resignation is the show that you stand as a free entity towards which nothing, if you do not will it, will not count. Now, they can break your body, the external world is external world. But quite literally, the will cannot be broken into unless the will wills it. Something very similar he says in the chapter on self-consciousness in the phenomenology, about how self-consciousness really is absolute in a sense in which nothing enters into desire that desire itself doesn't desire. Nobody can force you to actually believe anything you don't believe or don't want to believe, or stop believing. Nobody can make you love or desire anything you don't actually desire. They can make you appear, you can give into that, but they can't actually make you if you don't actually want to. And that's why Hegel says, there's an absoluteness to self-consciousness where even life is nothing to it. Self-consciousness, or in this case, in the truth, reasoning thought, is impermeable. It is absolute. You may break its external appearance, but you can never lay hold of it by external power.
Do you think that's what Bartleby was about?
In a way, yeah, you can definitely interpret that. For those of you who aren't familiar, which I wasn't familiar with this until like last week, it's referring to Bartleby the Scrivener, which is a great short story. Yeah, I would say I forget what the name of the main guy telling the story is, and him being bothered by Bartleby is entirely like he allowed Bartleby to to annoy him, basically.
Well, it's because he couldn't make Bartleby change his mind. He preferred not to, and there was a recognition in that it has to be internal. It's not external.
Yeah. There's certainly one could say, well, why he just said he preferred not to, but that never made him. But it's also clearly indicated that he couldn't have made him even if he had tried. But anyways, continuing. It has been remarked that the result, it is so, is the result of the necessity to which human beings cling. They hold fast to it as a result, that is, in the sense that they produce this abstract being. This is the other moment of necessity, mediation through the negation of other being. This other is the determinate in general, with which we have seen as inner existence, the giving up of concrete purposes and interests. For the latter are not only the ties that bind humans to externality and thus subject them to it, they are themselves also the particular element and are external to what is most inward, the self-thinking, pure universality, the simple relation of freedom to itself. It is the strength of this freedom that it can, in this abstract way, comprise within itself and put within itself that particular element that is outside it, and thus make it into something external in which it is no longer disturbed. The reason why we human beings are unhappy or dissatisfied or simply peevish is the cleavage within us, that is, the contradiction in the fact that these drives, aims, and interests, or simply these demands, wishes, and reflections are in us, and that at the same time our existence has in it what is the other of these things, their antithesis. This split or discontent in us can be resolved in a twofold manner. On the one hand, our external existence, our condition, the circumstances that affect us, and which our interests are generally involved, may be brought into harmony with the roots of their interest in us, a harmony that is experienced as happiness and satisfaction. On the other hand, however, when a split occurs between the two and unhappiness comes about, instead of satisfaction, there is a natural repose of the heart, or when the injury goes deeper and affects an energetic will, and its just claims, the heroic strength of will produces at the same time a contentment by taking kindly to the given state of things and submitting to what actually is. This is not a yielding in which what is external, the circumstances and conditions of things, are let go of one-sidedly because they are overcome and overpowered. Rather, it is a giving up by its own will of inner determinateness, allowing it to go. The freedom of abstraction is not without pain, but the pain is brought down to the level of natural pain. It is not the pain of repentance or the rebellion of wrongdoing. It has no consolation and hope. But then it is not in need of consolation, for consolation presupposes a claim that is still maintained and asserted, a claim that in one way is not satisfied but in another way desires a compensation, a desire that in the act of hoping has been kept in reserve. Spirit here? Hey, Spirit. It's very relevant to the discussions we've been having. But it is just here that we find the above-mentioned moment of sadness, which is diffused beyond this transfiguration of necessity into freedom. This freedom is the result of mediation through the negation of finite things. As abstract being, the satisfaction thus attained is empty reference to self, the empty solitude of self-consciousness with itself. This defect lies in the determinateness of the result as well as of the starting point. It is the same in both of these, namely just the indeterminateness of being. The same defect that has been noted in the form of the process of necessity, as this process exists in the volitional region of subjective spirit, will also be found in the process when it is an objective content for the thinking consciousness. But the defect does not lie in the nature of the process itself, and we have now to consider the latter in theoretical form. This is our special task. Okay, that was the 12th lecture. Pretty short. What's the title? Critique of Absolute Necessity. So as a quick overview, it seems to me that the critique of absolute necessity is that absolute necessity cannot really have the form of necessity anymore in reality. It has to have a form of freedom. That even and the examples about the will here, I think, are telling about the whole thing about resignation, the resigning oneself to fate, that it is what it is so. That resignation itself is just an act of freedom. Now, it might not be like the highest act of freedom, but it is a real act of freedom. Like, it's no longer in the shape of necessity. So it makes sense. I think it makes pretty good sense, even by common standards of meaning, that the thought of absolute necessity must yield its opposite, which is freedom. Looking over the last paragraph, this freedom is the result of mediation through the negation of finite things. But it is just here that we find the above-mentioned moment of sadness, which is diffused beyond this transfiguration of necessity into freedom. This freedom is the result of mediation through the negation of finite things. As abstract of being, the satisfaction thus attained is empty reference to self, the empty solitude of self-consciousness with itself. This defect lies in the determinateness of the result as well as of the starting point. It is the same in both of these, namely just the indeterminateness of being. The same defect that has been noted in the form of the process of necessity, as this process exists in the volitional region of subjective spirit, will also be found in the process when it is an objective content for the thinking consciousness. But the defect does not lie in the nature of the process itself, and we have now to consider the latter in theoretical form. This is our special task. All right, that's pretty good. Let's move on to the next one. Lecture 13. The defect in the argument from contingency to necessity. The general form of the process has already been described as a self-mediation that contains the moment of mediation with an other in such a way that the other is posited as something negated or ideal. This process has likewise been set forth in its more detailed aspects as the religious path to the elevation in humanity to God. We have now to compare what is formally expressed as a proof with the interpretation we have given of the self-elevation of the spirit to God. The difference between them seems slight, but it is important and supplies the reason why such proof is regarded as inadequate and has generally been abandoned. Because the world is contingent, therefore, and absolute necessary being or essence exist. This is a simple way in which the connection is established. Since mention is made here of an essence, and since we have spoken only of absolute necessity, this necessity may certainly be hypostatized in this way, but the essence is still indeterminate, not the subject of anything living, and still less is its spirit. We shall, however, discuss later the extent to which this essence as such has a determinate quality that may still be of interest here. What is of primary importance is the relationship that is indicated in the proposition. Because the one, the contingent, exists or is, therefore the other, the absolutely necessary, is. Here there are two entities in connection, one being with another being, a connection that we have seen in the form of external necessity. It is precisely this external necessity, however, that is recognized immediately to be a dependence in which the result depends on its starting point, but which, in fact, by sinking to a state of contingency, is recognized to be unsatisfying. It is against it, accordingly, that the protests have been advanced against this method of proof. To be specific, it comprises the connection in terms of which the one determinate quality, that of absolutely necessary being, is mediated by the other, that of contingent being. As a consequence, the former is placed in a relationship of dependence, indeed a relationship of what is conditioned to its condition. This is the main objection that Jacobi has on the whole brought against the knowledge of God, that to know or to comprehend means merely to derive a thing from its proximate causes, or to have insight into the order of its immediate conditions. Therefore, to comprehend the unconditioned means to make it into something conditioned or an effect. The latter category, however, which entails taking the absolutely necessary as an effect, falls at once by the wayside, since this sort of relationship too directly contradicts the quality with which we are here concerned, that of the absolutely necessary. The circumstance of the condition, which is also that of the ground, is, however, more external and can be more readily insinuated. In any event, it is present in the proposition. Because the contingent exists, so also does the absolutely necessary. All right, just let me go over this a bit more slowly. To be specific, it comprises the connection in terms of which the one determinate quality, that of absolutely necessary being, is mediated by the other, that of contingent being. As a consequence, the former is placed in a relationship of dependence, indeed a relationship of what is conditioned to its condition. So just putting absolute necessity in relationship to the contingent puts the absolute necessary in a contingent relationship, which makes it contingent, that it's only the absolute necessary in virtue of the contingent which is contingent upon it. This is the main objection that Jacobi has on the whole brought against the knowledge of God, that to know or to comprehend means merely to derive a thing from its proximate causes, or to have insight into the order of its immediate conditions. Therefore, to comprehend the unconditioned means to make it into something conditioned or an effect. So, the proposition, because the one, the contingent, exists or is, therefore the other, the absolutely necessary, is. Okay, then. Yeah, it's very clear what one could even see. It's almost, there's some people who probably point out that maybe this is a wordplay or something. That maybe it's a grammatical illusion. There's somebody I was talking to yesterday who was adamant that all that Hegel does is just a grammatical illusion of language. That because they phrase it in this way, that in which they say, because the contingent exists or is, therefore the other, the absolutely necessary, is. Which literally in grammatical form here, like just the order of the sentence, makes the contingent the cause for the absolute necessary. Because there's the contingent, there must be the absolute necessary. But this is a contradiction in the concept. Is my sound working fine? Hello?
Yep.
Okay. I don't know, it makes sense to me. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that is very weird, now that you bring it up.
Like, just the ways it's phrased is contradictory.
Yeah.
So the latter category, however, which entails taking the absolutely necessary as an effect, falls at once by the wayside, since this sort of relationship too directly contradicts the quality with which we are here concerned, that of the absolutely necessary. The circumstance of the condition, which is also that of the ground, is, however, more external and can be more readily insinuated. In any event, it is present in the proposition. Because the contingent exists, so also does the absolutely necessary. While this defect must be conceded, it is to be observed, on the contrary, that no objective significance is to be given to such a relationship of conditionedness and dependence. This relationship is present only in a wholly subjective sense. The proposition does not state, and is not meant to state, that the absolutely necessary has conditions, and indeed is conditioned by the contingent world. Quite the contrary. The whole process of the connection exists only in the act of proving. It is only our knowledge of the absolutely necessary being that is conditioned by that starting point. The absolutely necessary does not exist by raising itself out of the world of contingency and requiring this world as its starting point and presupposition, in order that, by starting from it, it first attains to its being. What has to be thought of as something mediated by an other, as something dependent and conditioned, cannot be absolutely necessary, cannot be God. It is the content of the proof itself that corrects a defect that is visible only in its form. Thus we have before us a variation or a deviation of the form from the nature of the content, and the form is all the more defective just because its content is the absolutely necessary. This content is not itself intrinsically without form, as was evident from its determinate quality. Its own form, as the form of the true, is itself true, while the form that deviates from it is the untrue. Yeah. So the propositional form, it's like anybody who is charitable to it would notice that that argument is like that. Just because you state it in the form of because contingent exists, so the absolutely must exist. It's not really saying that the absolutely necessary is contingent upon the contingent. Nonetheless, the form does put it that way, and that's part of its defect. And even if you take it charitably, it still does not prove its point, because the absolutely necessary has no content at this stage. If we take what we have generally called form in its more concrete signification, namely as cognitive knowledge, we find ourselves in the midst of the well-known and popular categories of finite knowledge, which as subjective is generally defined as finite, and the course of its epistemological movement as a finite activity. Here, accordingly, the same inadequacy appears, but in another shape. Cognition is a finite act, and such an act cannot be the comprehension of the absolutely necessary, the infinite. Cognition demands, after all, that to follow the content it must have it within itself. The cognition that has an absolutely necessary, infinite content must itself be absolutely necessary and infinite. We thus find ourselves in the best position for wrestling once again with the antithesis whose affirmative outcome we took under consideration in the earlier lectures. An outcome aided by rather more of immediate knowledge, faith, feeling, etc. We must accordingly now leave this shape of the form aside, but shall later offer some reflections on its categories. We have in the meantime to consider the form in the more precise mode in which it appears in the proof presently under discussion. If we recall the formal syllogism previously discussed, one part of the first proposition, the major premise, states, if the contingent is, and this is expressed more directly in another premise, there is a contingent world. While in the first premise the quality of contingency is posited essentially in its connection with the absolutely necessary, it is posited nevertheless as a contingency that has being. It is in the second premise, the quality of having being, as applied to the first premise, that the defect lies. And this in fact means that it is directly self-contradictory and shows itself to be in its very nature an untrue one-sidedness. The contingent, the finite, is expressed as something that has being, but the determinate quality of the finite is rather to have an end, to collapse to be the sort of being that has only the value of a possibility, and that can just as well exist as not exist. This fundamental error is found in the form of connection that an ordinary syllogism is. Such a syllogism has on the whole a permanent immediacy in its premises. It has presuppositions that are declared to be not merely primary, but an existing, enduring primacy with which the other is connected as a consequence, a conditioned thing, etc., in such a way that the two determinations thus linked together constitute an external, finite relationship to each other, in which each of the two sides is in connection with the other. What constitutes one of the two determinations has at the same time a subsistence of its own outside of its connection. The determination that the two distinguished elements together constitute in that proposition, and that in itself is utterly one, is the absolutely necessary. Its name at once declares it to be only one, the only one, what truly is the sole actuality. We have seen how its concept is a mediation that returns into itself, a mediation only with itself, through the other that is distinguished from it, and that is sublated in the one, the absolutely necessary, negated as something having being, and preserved only as something ideal. However, outside of this absolute inward unity, the two sides of the relation are in this kind of syllogism kept externally apart from each other as entities. The contingent is. This proposition is inherently self-contradictory, and is likewise in contradiction with the result, absolute necessity, which is not merely placed on one side, but rather is the whole being. If therefore we begin with the contingent, we must not set out from it as something that remains fixed in such a way that in the progression it continues to have being. This is only one side of its determinateness, rather it is to be posited in its full determinate character, which means that non-being may just as well be attributed to it, and that consequently it enters into the result as a passing away. Not because the contingent is, but rather because it is non-being, only appearance, because its being is not genuine actuality. It is because of this that absolute necessity is. The latter is its being and truth. Okay, so that was a bit dense. We will go back through this. Okay, starting back, middle page 171. If we take what we have generally called form in its more concrete signification, namely as cognitive knowledge, we find ourselves in the midst of the well-known and popular categories of finite knowledge, which as subjective is generally defined as finite in the course of its epistemological movement as a finite activity. Here accordingly the same inadequacy appears, but in another shape. Cognition is a finite act, and such an act cannot be the comprehension of the absolute necessary, the infinite. Cognition demands, after all, that to follow the content it must have it within itself. The cognition that has an absolutely necessary infinite content must itself be absolutely necessary and infinite. We thus find ourselves in the best position for wrestling once again with the antithesis, whose affirmative outcome we took under consideration in the earlier lectures, an outcome aided by rather more of immediate knowledge, faith, feeling, etc. We must accordingly now leave the shape in the form outside, but shall later offer some reflections on its categories. We have in the meantime to consider the form in the more precise mode in which it appears in the proof presently under discussion. So I assume this was a criticism of the Kantian view of things, that the moment you take a fundamental epistemological point of view, if you take cognition as having to wrestle with this issue, and you're like, okay, well, like, what is the infinite? What of the infinite can cognition cognize? Well, since the infinite would have to be within cognition, and if it was within cognition, then cognition itself would be infinite, but then it wouldn't really be reducible then to cognition would go beyond itself as cognition, as I understand this. That then the whole distinction, because it is a real infinity and an absolute necessity of itself, then would make the whole distinction of cognition its object moot. Does that make sense? Yeah, also welcome, Pedro.
Hello.
We got to the good stuff on the lectures, by the way, so getting to some logical stuff. So if we recall the formal syllogism previously discussed, one part of the first proposition, the major premise states, if the contingent is, and this is expressed more directly in another premise, there is a contingent world. While in the first premise, the quality of contingency is posited essentially in its connection with the absolutely necessary, it is posited nevertheless as a contingency that has being. It is in the second premise, the quality of having being as applied to the first premise, that a defect lies, and this in fact means that it is directly self-contradictory and shows itself to be, in its very nature, an untrue one-sidedness. The contingent, the finite, is expressed as something that has being, but the determinate quality of the finite is rather to have an end, to collapse, to be the sort of being that has only the value of a possibility, and then can just as well exist as not exist. So to put it in a slightly different language, the problem with even just putting forth if the contingent is, or there is a contingent world, is that it's making an unwarranted assumption that the contingent can be attributed being at all. Because once it is, it's not really, it is not, it's not contingent, because once it is, it exists, and once it exists, it's determinate, and it has all these connections. Therefore, it becomes necessary within the chain of connections. But as merely contingent, it neither is nor is not. It could be, but it's only a possibility. Now I think that there's propositionally, if the contingent is is fine. To the extent that the if here places that it could be or could not be. But beyond that, you couldn't then state, oh well, if the contingent is, and there's a possible world, there's an absolute necessary being. But from the contingent alone, you can't then take the step from the if to like whether it is or is not. The fundamental error is found in the form of connection that an ordinary syllogism is. Such a syllogism has on the whole a permanent immediacy in its premises. It has presuppositions that are declared to be not merely primary, but an existing, enduring primacy with which the other is connected as a consequence, a conditioned thing, etc., in such a way that the two determinations thus linked together constitute an external, finite relationship to each other in which each of the two sides is in connection with the other. What constitutes one of the two determinations has at the same time a subsistence of its own outside of its connections. So here would be the contingent as contingent in the syllogistic form is taken as independent from the absolutely necessary. And the absolutely necessary is also taken as independent from the contingent. The determination that the two distinguished elements together constitute in that proposition, and that in itself is utterly one, is the absolutely necessary. Its name at once declares it to be the only one, what truly is, the sole actuality. We have seen how its concept is the mediation that returns into itself, a mediation only with itself through the other that is distinguished from it and that is sublated in the one, the absolutely necessary, negated as something having being, and then preserved only as something ideal. However, outside of this absolute inward unity, the two sides of the relation are in this kind of syllogism kept externally apart from each other as entities. The contingent is. This proposition is inherently self-contradictory, and is likewise in contradiction with the result absolute necessity, which is not merely placed on one side, but rather is the whole being. So, we already have that, the form of that syllogism. If there is a contingent world, then there is an absolute necessary being. That's the syllogism. And Hegel's saying, well, it's not that thing that follows as a conclusion, then there is an absolute necessary being, or there's an absolute necessity, suffices. Because in truth, the absolute necessity has to be the entire syllogism itself. And in in regular propositional forms, you can't actually do this. I've never seen it done, and if anybody would claim that it could be done, I'd like to see it. So, what was it? Well, last time we were reading, right, the issue of contingency, necessity, and also the absolute necessity, in which the way to make this proper syllogism in the Hegelian sense would be to put forth the concept of the contingent. Not say that the contingent is or is not, but just put forth the concept of contingent, which imminently and explicitly has to already then link directly to necessity. That which is contingent is that which is not necessary. So it could be or not be, could not be, but the link of what makes it contingent in the first place as a contingency has to be the necessity, which links it as contingent. So contingency's own contingence is a necessary connection to itself. So the contingent is conditioned by all these other contingent conditions, but those conditions then become a necessary link between themselves, as each positing the condition which affects the others. But then this totality of conditions as a necessary chain of events turns every single condition as a cause, the necessity, but itself as an effect, because if you stop it at that and you say, okay, now the buck stops here, this is the final cause, this is the necessity which is necessary for all the necessities, but that necessity in itself is not necessary. It is just purely contingent. There is no reason for why it would be. So then it falls into contingency again. So we get the dialectic of the contingent to the necessary and back again. And then this whole circuit is then what absolute necessity is. And then we have the full syllogism properly, because now the full syllogism is, okay, absolute necessity is the self-positing of the necessary as contingent and the contingent as necessary. So you have a necessary contingence and a contingent necessity, as well as the contingent and necessary as necessary within that. So from the conclusion of the syllogism as a whole, the premises both are developed imminently, and from the premises you get the conclusion of the whole as well. So that's the distinction between the Hegelian syllogisms, which can generate the entire argument from any side of the premise, be it the conclusion or any of the premises that set up the conclusion, either way. Whereas in a regular propositional syllogism, this isn't really the case. From some conclusion stated abstractly, there's no telling what may or may not be implied as premises, because at least in the propositional form, the usual issue is that you have to specify what the issue is, because otherwise people get lost. They're like, well, what even is the conclusion that we're supposed to be deriving elements backwards from? And then you can be given any elements, and you also don't know from that what other conclusions you should make. a single premise does not make for an argument in propositional logic. I don't know. Makes sense, DM?
It was super well explained.
Yeah, no, I get it. Like, a premise, by itself can't really mean anything in a formal argument, because it's just a statement, really. But it's that when you put the statements together, then you have your conclusion. It's like, let's input a bunch of statements to output a conclusion.
Yeah, and with Hegel, you don't even have to put a proposition, just put a concept forward. It's going to generate an argument.
Yeah, it goes to the difference between what you were saying about definitional versus operational.
Yeah, it's very related. All right, continuing. This moment of the negative is not found in the form taken by the syllogism of the understanding, and therefore the latter is defective in the region of the living reason of spirit, in the region wherein absolute necessity itself is considered as the true result, as something that does indeed mediate itself through an other, but mediates itself with itself by sublating the other. Thus, the course of the knowledge of necessity is different from the process that necessity itself is. Such a course is therefore not to be taken as an absolutely necessary and true movement, but as finite activity. It is not infinite knowledge. It does not have the infinite as its content and activity, for the infinite is only this mediation with itself through the negation of the negative. The defect that has been pointed out in this form of reasoning means, as I have been indicating, that the elevation of the spirit to God has not been correctly explained in the proof of the existence of God that it constitutes. If we compare the two, we see that this elevation is undoubtedly also a transcending of worldly existence, a transcending of what is merely temporal, changeable, and transitory. The world is indeed declared to be something that exists, and we start from it. But since, as remarked, it is defined as the temporal, contingent, changeable, and transitory, its being is not satisfying. It is not the true affirmative. It is defined as what sublates and negates itself. It does not persistently retain its determination to be, rather a being is only attributed to it that has no more value than a non-being, whose intrinsic quality is its non-being, its other, and thus its contradiction, its dissolution, its passing away. But even when it may seem to be the case, or in fact the case, that as far as faith is concerned, this contingent being as something present to consciousness remains standing on the one side, over against the other, the eternal, the necessary in and for itself, standing as a world above which is heaven, still the real point is not that a double world is represented, but rather the value attached to such a representation. This value is expressed when it is said that the one world is the world of appearance or illusion, and the other the world of truth. When the former is abandoned and a transition is made to the latter in such a way that the world of appearance still remains on this side, the connection between them as it presents itself to the religious person does not mean that the world is anything more than a starting point, or that it is permanently fixed as a ground to which the power of being, grounding, and conditioning could be attributed. Satisfaction, everything in the way of this sort of grounding, is rather found to be located in the eternal world as what it is independent in and for itself. As opposed to this religious awareness, the being of both sides is expressed in a similar way in the form taken by the syllogism. In the premise of connection, if a contingent world exists, so also an absolutely necessary exists. In the second premise, wherein it is stated as a presupposition that a contingent world does exist, and in the third, concluding proposition, therefore an absolutely necessary exists. So if I understood this correctly, he's saying that here that the very form of reasoning we're putting forth, or the very propositional form, causes us to misunderstand. That if we understand the contingent as contingent and the absolutely necessary as two distinct things only contingently united by their syllogism within us, it gets us to think of the world in this dualistic sense, that there is the true world in some other sense, which is completely disconnected from this illusory and false world. in this way, one would say, one can say that there's various I'm thinking of a bad example. The way I would put this is actually what comes up in the phenomenology of spirit, which is the acknowledgement that the way we think about the world necessarily structures what we would think the world is. So if we think from the standpoint of the understanding, the world will look like a world of the understanding. And the understanding only understands distinctions and absolute differences and identities in abstraction. So if that's the only mode of reasoning that we are acquainted with, that we are experienced with, that's the only way the world's going to look like to us, necessarily. And such things are why presuppositions are so far-reaching, that they are not innocent things within our cognition. They must really be interrogated deeply. And some people don't like that. A few remarks may be added about the propositions thus expressed. First of all, in respect to the last of them, the linkage of the two opposed determinate qualities is at once noticeable. Therefore, the absolute necessary exists. Therefore expresses mediation through an other, but exist expresses immediacy and directly sublates the former quality, which, as has been indicated as what explains why such knowledge regarding whatever is its object, is inadmissible. The sublation of mediation through an other is, however, not only present implicitly, the portrayal of the syllogism rather expresses the same explicitly. Truth is such a power that it is present even in what is false, and it only requires correct observation and attention to discover the true in the false, or rather to see it there. The true is here mediation with self by negation of the other and by mediation through an other. The negation of both mediation through an other and abstract and mediated immediacy is present in the therefore exists. Further, if the one proposition is the contingent exists and the other is what is necessary in and for itself exists, this essentially reflects the fact that the being of the contingent is of a wholly different value from that of intrinsically necessary being, but nevertheless being is the one common determinate quality in both propositions. The transition, accordingly, is not from one form of being to another, but rather from one determination of thought to another. Being purifies itself from the predicate of contingency that is inadequate to it. Being is simple equality with self. Contingency, however, is being that is absolutely unequal to itself and self-contradictory. And it is only in the absolutely necessary that it is at once more restored to this condition of self-equality. It is here, therefore, that this process of elevation to God, or this aspect of the proof, differs more specifically from the others that have been indicated. In the first of the two processes, the equality that has to be proved, or that is supposed to result, is not being. Being is rather what the two aspects always have in common. It continues from the one to the other. In the other process, by contrast, the transition has to be made from the concept of God to God's being. This transition appears to be more difficult than that from a specification of content, which we are accustomed to call a concept, to another concept, to what is more homogeneous, therefore, than the transition from concept to being is apt to appear. Let me reread that. Starting again from a few remarks. A few remarks may be added about the propositions thus expressed. First of all, in respect to the last of them, the linkage of the two opposed determinate qualities is at once noticeable. Therefore, the absolutely necessary exists. Therefore expresses mediation through an other, but exist expresses immediacy and directly sublates the former quality, which, as has been indicated, is what explains why such knowledge regarding whatever its object is inadmissible. Okay, so that's that's a pretty good point. that once again the propositional form fails us. Therefore is already a relative mediating relationship. It's a causal relationship of some sort, one could say, or a positive relationship. From the therefore, then, the absolutely necessary exists, and existence in the science of logic is just the immediate being of existence, the unity of being a nothing, which hides the distinction of being a nothing. It just is. Kind of takes a higher but not that different standpoint from abstract being. So you take the mediation, then you hide it under immediacy again. And in a real syllogism, this can't happen. You can't. This should be, in the conclusion, should be the complete retainer or retainment of all the prior elements. In this case would be the prior propositions and the operators that link the propositions. The sublation of mediation through an other is, however, not only present implicitly, the portrayal of the syllogism rather expresses the same explicitly. And here sublation just means the subsumption or cancellation. Oh no, what did I do? Truth is such a power that is present even in what is false, and it only requires correct observation. Yes. So for those of you who don't know, Hegel is completely against the notion of the absolute opposition between truth and falsehood. In reality, falsehood is just what we call a incomplete truth. So there's truth all the way, and falsehood only makes sense as this relationship of an incomplete truth to the truth as complete and self-subsisting, self-determinate, absolutely necessary in this case. The negation of both mediation through an other and abstract immediate immediacy is present in the therefore exist. Further, if the one proposition is, the contingent exists, and the other, what is necessary in and for itself, exists. This essentially reflects the fact that the being of the contingent is of a wholly different value from that of the intrinsically necessary being. But nevertheless, being is the one common determinate quality in both propositions. The transition accordingly is not from one form of being to another, but rather from one determination of thought to another. That language right there. It's not from one form of being to another, but rather from one determination of thought to another. Determination of thought. People don't understand this. And I myself understand why, but experientially I really don't get how people don't get this. That Hegel himself tells us in the science of logic that all he's dealing with are thought determinations. There is no thing called being. There is no thing called essence. And there is no thing called concept. These are not, when people think about metaphysics, they think about like things out there in the world somehow, materially or immaterially. But all this stuff is within thought, about thought, which are determinations of the self-understanding of thought. Which is not to say that this is that much clearer to people, I guess, because they have presuppositions about what thought is, whereas the logic has no presuppositions as to thought being this subjective process, arbitrary process that goes on in your head. So, anyways, his point there that the contingent exists and what is necessary in and for itself exists. The exists part of that actually is playing no role here at all, if you pay attention to it. The actual things playing a role is contingency and necessity. That's what's really playing the role. And the real movement here is between contingency and necessity. It has nothing really to do with existence. Existence is equal to both of them. So it's not that contingency is a different kind of existence. Contingency is much higher than existence. In fact, existence is a type of contingency and a type of necessity. So that's a very good point of his. Being purifies itself from the predicate of contingency that is inadequate to it. A being is simple equality with self. Contingency, however, is being that is absolutely unequal to itself and self-contradictory. That is only in the absolutely necessary that it is once more restored to this condition of self-equality. It is here, however, that this process of elevation to God, or this aspect of the proof, it differs more specifically from others that have been indicated. In the first of the two processes, the quality that has been proved, or that is supposed to result, is not being. Being is rather that the two aspects always have in common. It continues from the one to the other. In the other process, by contrast, the transition has to be made from the concept of God to God's being. Okay, I'm not quite sure what the process he's talking about. They continue to exist. What is necessary for itself exist. So in the first, which is the contingency exists, the quality has to be proved, or that is supposed to result, is not being. Being is rather what the two aspects always have in common. It continues from the one to the other. Okay, wait. Does anybody here understand what process he's referring to? In the first of the two processes, the quality has to be proved, or that is supposed to result, is not being. Being is rather what the two aspects always have in common. It continues from one to the other.
Okay, I mean, he starts by saying this process of elevation to God.
Okay, I think I have a clue. So this whole thing about he's saying that the difference between the movement of these propositions from the contingent exists to, therefore, what is necessary in and for itself exists. There is one way in which we can see contingency as a form of existence and necessity as a form of existence. So as that first process, that if we take the syllogism to be about that, this process, in the first of the two processes, the quality that has to be proved, or that is supposed to result, is not being. Being is rather what the two aspects always have in common. It continues from the one to the other. Right, so in the contingency exists and the necessary exists, if these are supposed to be consequences of being, what remains in them is just being. Being is always in common. In the other process, by contrast, the transition has to be made from the concept of God to God's being. That would be from contingency to necessity. This transition appears to be more difficult than that from a specification of content, which we are accustomed to call a concept, to another concept, to what is more homogeneous, therefore, than the transition from concept to being is apt to appear. trying to figure out what the... Okay, so I think I made sense of what the process of the first is. So the issue of of the argument for contingency is we need the necessary for the contingent existence, because the contingent existence does not suffice for itself. Because it is contingent, it requires that which sustains it, which causes it and conditions it. So the question, in the regular way in which this question is posed, that if the contingent exists, the contingent exists, therefore what is necessary in and for itself exists. The way that is framed is really a question about where the existence lies. It's not really about contingency and its connection to necessity at all. So the question is about existence. Well, the contingent exists, but the contingent can't exist by its own power. Where then is the real existence? Well, the real existence must be in the necessary in and for itself. And that is the first process. In the first of the two processes, the quality that has to be proved or that is supposed to result is not being, or rather, being is rather what the two aspects always have in common. It continues from the one to the other. Although, wow. Now, but the quality that has to be proved or that is supposed to result is not being. Being is rather the two aspects always have in common. It continues from the one to the other. Nope, still confused. Any thoughts, Rain?
It's tricky. Needs to be distinguishing between what is in and for itself and being in the what you've underlined in red. Being is only what they have in common and is shared, but what makes them distinct is what is in and for itself versus what is contingent. So being has to be what is in and for itself, or else I'm not sure.
See, being purifies itself from the predicate of contingency that is inadequate to it. Being is simple equality with self. Contingency, however, is being that is absolutely unequal to itself and is self-contradictory. And it is only in the absolutely necessary that it is once more restored to this condition of self-equality. It is here, therefore, that this process of elevation to God, or this aspect of the proof, differs more specifically from the others that have been indicated. In the first of the two processes, the quality that is to be proved, or that is supposed to result, is not being. Being is rather what the two aspects always have in common.
Oh, I think the two aspects is referring to both sides of the contingency in the first proposition. It could be, it could not be. That distinction has to be. So the being of the distinction between could be and could not be has being that is retained in either instance. In the other process, by contrast, the transition has to be made from the concept of God to God's being. So in the other
Another way to see it, I suppose, is that it's what he was saying earlier, that the way it is stated already assumes the being, which would be the assumption that the connection of these categories is given. And we're not critical about it. So, we're not going to prove, we're not trying to consider the proof of whether these categories really connect at all. It's already taken as for granted that they are. So, the proof isn't going to be that these categories are what they are and that they connect as we're connecting them. That's just taken for granted. Being is rather, The quality that has to be proved, or that is supposed to result, is not being. Being is rather what the two aspects always have in common. It continues from the one to the other. Okay, I think that makes sense. Yeah, that this is just an issue of presupposition that in the first process, that if we just take it for the fact that we take it for granted that they are. Whereas in the other process, the transition has to be made from the concept of God, which is the process of considering the concepts themselves, does have to do with proving what they are, as opposed to taking it as granted. I think that makes sense of it.
Yeah.
All right, moving on. This transition appears to be more difficult than that from a specification of content, which we are accustomed to call a concept to another concept, to what is more homogeneous, therefore, than the transition from concept to being is apt to appear. So he's saying the transition from concept to concept is more homogeneous because it's, rather than a transition from concept to being, and by being people mean natural external existence.
I think he's indicating that in the second process, we're just trying to get back to what we started from.
Yeah, because it's because with Hegel, it's like the proof of God's existence is like he's already stated in the prior lectures that it's a nonsensical kind of question. So the question of the concept of God and God's being is not whether God exists out there in the natural world, and therefore we prove that. No, the question is, what is God in the first place? And so developing the concept of what God is the answer to God's being. Which makes sense to me.
Yeah, it's like if God has to be, he's necessary in and for itself, what is it that is necessary in and for itself? So it's attempting to think that necessity in and for itself.
Yeah. So the notion that lies at the basis here is that being is not itself a concept or thought. In this antithesis in which it is exhibited as for itself and isolated, the appropriate place to consider it will be in connection with that proof. Here, however, we have not initially to take it abstractly and for itself. That it is the common element in the two qualities, the contingent and the absolute necessary, suggests a comparison and external separation between it and them. While initially it is in an inseparable union with each, with contingent being and absolutely necessary being. In this way, we shall once again take up the indicated shape of the proof and bring out more closely the difference in the contradiction that it undergoes in the two opposed sides, the speculative and the abstractly rational. The indicated proposition expresses the following connection. Because contingent being exists, so also does absolutely necessary being. If we take this connection in its simple sense, without defining it more precisely by the category of a ground, or reason and the like, its meaning is merely this. Contingent being is at the same time the being of an other, that of the absolutely necessary being. This phrase at the same time seems to be a contradiction, over against which two opposed propositions are placed as solutions, of which the one is, the being of the contingent is not its own being, but only the being of an other, and indeed it is defined as the being of its other, the absolutely necessary. And the other proposition is, the being of the contingent is only its own being, and not the being of an other, the absolutely necessary. It has been shown that the first proposition has the true meaning, which was also expressed by the notion of a transition. We shall take up further the speculative connection that is itself immanent in the categories of thought that constitute contingency. The other proposition, however, is that of the understanding, to which modern times has so attached itself. What can be more reasonable than to hold that any sort of thing or existence is so too the contingent because it is its own being, is in fact just the determinate being that it is and not an other. The contingent is in this way retained on its own account, separated from the absolutely necessary. Okay, so that first one, the being of the contingent is not its own being, but only the being of an other, and indeed it is defined as the being of its other, the absolutely necessary. A speculative proposition. No passage from the finite to the infinite? How long is this? No, not that long. It is easier to employ the categories of finite and infinite to express the two qualities of contingent and absolutely necessary, and thus to take the finite for itself as isolated from its other, the infinite. Therefore it is said that there is no bridge, no passage from finite being to infinite. The finite is related simply to itself, not to its other. The distinction made between knowledge as form and as content is an empty one. Precisely this difference between the two was rightly made the basis of syllogisms. Syllogisms that initially presuppose that knowledge is finite and for this reason conclude that knowledge cannot know the infinite because it is incapable of comprehending it. Conversely, it is concluded that if knowledge did comprehend the infinite, it would necessarily be infinite itself. But it is admittedly not infinite and therefore is incapable of knowing the infinite. Its action is defined in accord with its content. Finite knowledge and infinite knowledge yield the same relationship as that of finite and infinite generally. The only difference is that infinite knowledge is even more strongly repulsed by its other than the naked infinite is, and points more directly to the separation of the two sides, so that only one remains finite knowledge. In this way, every relationship of mediation falls away, every relationship in which the finite and the infinite as such, as well as the contingent and the absolutely necessary, might have stood. The form of finite and infinite is the one that has come to be most in vogue in this way of looking at the matter. This form is more abstract and thus appears to be more comprehensive than the first mentioned. The finite in general and finite knowledge thus have necessity essentially ascribed to them in addition to contingency. This necessity takes the form of progression in the series of causes and effects, conditions and conditioned. It was earlier described by us as external necessity and was included as something in common with the finite. It can be understood indeed only in reference to the finite, and when including the finite, it is placed in contrast with the infinite without the misunderstanding that might arise from use of the category of the absolutely necessary. If, accordingly, we keep the latter expression, then the relationship of finitude and infinitude to which we hold will be that of their lack of relationship and reference. We find ourselves with a claim that the finite on the whole and finite knowledge are incapable of grasping the infinite in general as well as in its form as absolute necessity, or also of comprehending the infinite by means of the concept of contingency and finitude from which finite knowledge starts. Finite knowledge is therefore finite just because it is based on finite concepts, and the finite, including also finite knowledge, is related only to itself and remains only with itself, because it is only its being, not in any sense the being of an other, least of all of its other. This is the proposition upon which so much reliance is placed. It provides no transition from the finite to the infinite, nor from the contingent to the absolutely necessary, nor from effect to an absolutely first non-finite cause. A gulf is simply fixed between them. All right. That was the end of Lecture 13. Pretty good. How long are we going for? That's a good place to stop today. For those of you listening, hopefully you found this interesting. See you next time.